You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Tiffany Cruikshank. Our podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts, Rachel Land and Katya Barch, as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness. All right, we are back, and we're here to talk about a subject that's near and dear to my heart. We're talking about burnout today, and something that I've spent a lot of time researching and digging into for the past year or so, and now teaching our resilience retreats all around the world to help bring some resources and tools, and now bring them to you as well. So bringing to people in person, but now bringing them to you guys online as a way to help support our communities, because burnout is such a huge topic now, and it's extremely prevalent, and it's, I think, a really interesting topic in the context of this podcast, because a healthy society doesn't produce extreme numbers of burnout, period. And so, I think in the context of this podcast, what we want to talk about is one, kind of talking to how the yoga practices can support this, but also even more so on a spoken podcast and an audio file, is what are the intangibles? What are the intangibles that I think, in my experience and from my perspective, are actually really the game changers for working with burnout? And so we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what it is, what causes it, how we can approach it, and in yoga, in some of the maybe more obvious ways, and then also some less obvious ways and more kind of mental mindset ways as well.
And I think
So
for
we're
me,
back.
that's
Yeah.
the bit that to me is the most interesting, because as usual, I feel like there's a perception out there that burnout is this one thing. This is what it is. This is how it looks. This is how it feels. And the remedy is also this one thing. This is what you do. And as usual with a yoga medicine podcast, I don't think it's that simple. I think there's a lot more to it. And there's lots of individual variation of both the experience and the appropriate remedy as well.
And it really is so complex. And it's why no one's really like perfectly decoded it. If you look into the burnout research and the approaches that are being used, and the outcomes, like, it's so mixed, and it does take a while. I mean, I think burnout typically is something that happens over longer periods of time. It's not something that happens overnight. So because of that, it also takes time to replenish and recharge and reset, the way the body responds to stress. But I think, in a general context, when we talk about burnout, and burnout is definitely a spectrum, that you can lie on different ends of that more extreme burnout, or more, um, you know, less extreme burnout, let's say. But the three key classic symptoms that are kind of really all over, everyone generally agrees with, is one being that symptom of exhaustion, which is really that extreme fatigue over longer periods of time, the cynicism and depersonalization that tends to happen, and then a feeling of inadequacy or feeling ineffective. I think um, all three of those together kind of form this picture of burnout. But what's really interesting, I think, is that it is very individual, and the details of how that shows up from person to person are very different. There are a lot of subtypes that can have different associations, but there are also three main subtypes within that are commonly researched. And one is like the person who's frenetic and overly involved and maybe micromanaging, or maybe being micromanaged. Another is, I think, less common, but still common enough that we talk about it, is the understimulated, underchallenged individual, someone with a very monotonous job that's not stimulating to them. And then the third is the person who's just really worn out and inefficient because of that. And so, and there can be combinations of those, there can be overlap. There's definitely this is what I think is really interesting, is, and I find a lot, as a really high association with perfectionism. Perfectionism takes those standards really high and really unattainable. And it's a big part for many people of what drive burnout, that kind of the causality behind it. But then also associated with things like imposter syndrome, which again
Mm.
drives us to kind of overwork and kind of goes along with that feeling inadequate and ineffective, and a low sense of accomplishment associated with burnout. But
Yeah.
really it is, having those three main symptoms: the exhaustion, the cynicism, and the feeling inadequate or ineffective, um, are kind of the harbingers of burnout. And there's a lot of reasons, of course, why that can happen too.
Yeah, and I feel like I've been all of those people at various times and various scenarios in my life of feeling this kind of cumulative overwork and overwhelm and my pace becoming frenetic, trying to deal with it and kind of put out all the fires and keep all of the plates spinning on top of those sticks, and then hitting the point where it doesn't even matter. It doesn't matter what I do. It's not working out. Nothing I do makes a difference here, yada, yada, yada. That phase for me is usually pretty short because what I think we don't always talk about in the context of burnout is that it can be a really positive catalyst for change. And it often has been for me. It's been the, and I'm done here. I've given it as much as I can possibly give. And this is my sign that it's time for me to do something else. And I've done that in a big way, exiting the corporate world and becoming a ski bum for several years. And I've also done it in lots of smaller ways as a yoga teacher, of it forcing me to sit down and weigh up different aspects of my work and determine whether they're worth the effort and energy that I'm investing. Am I being effective enough to make that worth my time, or am I best spending my time and energy elsewhere? And sometimes it prompts really big changes, and other times it prompts just more subtle shifts in my attitude towards or my approach towards some aspects of my work.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of people that's, those that ebb and flow that we go through, that's kind of like this natural inclination to like self-soothe, I guess maybe you
Mm,
could say, but to kind of take care of ourselves and do what we need to make it out of that place. And I think what ends up happening with burnout is we get to that place so many times that at some point we can't quite crawl out of it. There's not
mm,
enough energy to get the inspiration back, to get that sense of cynicism out, to feel effective and adequate. And
mm,
um yeah, and so the idea is that, for some people that might happen once or twice, and they get into this deep well. I like to think of it like a well. I think it
mm.
gives that visual of like what it feels like when you're there. And I think many people can probably relate to this on some point. Um, but like once we get into that like really deep burnout spectrum, there is this feeling of, kind of being stuck in that place and feeling so exhausted that we don't have the energy to kind of like be our own cheerleader, right? It's
Mhm,
like, I think we all have that cheerleader and the critic in our head. And, we can give into the cheerleader and get inspired and motivated and get back up and out there. And, there are times when our cheerleader just doesn't have any energy anymore. The critic wins, right?
I think my internal cheerleader is pretty small and pretty quiet at the best of times. Uh,
You get the point
I
though.
totally do. I love the analogy. And I also love the analogy of being down the well, down the bottom of this dark place that's very difficult to exit from. And exiting from it is going to take energy that you just don't have because the well's already empty. You've got nothing more to give. And I think this is why so often in the yoga world, we seem to think, when somebody is exhausted and feeling cynical and feeling overwhelmed or overburdened, well, the solution is restorative. We've got to put stuff back in. We've got to restore the energy. And yes, obviously, eventually you do want to refill those reserves, but I think many teachers have found, as I have, that it's not always the thing that you actually feel like you need when you're in that state. And when you find students who are burnt out and overwhelmed and you try to set them up somewhere
Yeah.
really quiet and soothing, many of them aren't ready to kind of get quiet and get still and to nourish themselves with their breath. So, have you come up
Yeah.
against that attitude as well? Like, yes, got to do restorative and really gentle work, and people just aren't in for it.
I think it really depends on the person and if they've ever done yoga, their
Mm,
familiarity and comfort in yin and restorative. Like for someone who's already done some yoga, you know, it's a little easier to find that. But for people who are really, really exhausted, sometimes it is really welcoming and needed and can be a great place to begin. But there are people who are exhausted but also fidgety. If any of you have done Chinese medicine with us, know like the yang deficient person is just so exhausted and they just soak up those restorative and yin poses. And the deficient person is exhausted, but they're also really fidgety and restless, and their mind is restless and they can't sit still. And yeah, and doing some movement for them can be helpful. So yeah, I agree. It's not like a like force yourself to do restorative and yin, but I do think, for everyone's so different. I think a lot of people listen to this are yoga teachers, so they're already kind of sold on restorative and yin. And yes, those people like we need to deviate back and go like, hey, there is something to training both sides of the nervous system. But to the non, you know, yoga aficionado, like, yeah, there is remembering and learning about the power and potency and value in the non-doing and these introspective practices like yin and restorative that can be so valuable and such an antidote to our busy modern lives, which are
mm,
busy and focus on the things we can check off our to-do list, rather than like spending time doing nothing and maybe like unplanned downtime, like going and taking a walk without an agenda, and stripping away that perfectionism and, comparison. And,
mhm.
you know, I love the saying like comparison is the thief of joy. And, it is like all these little mindset changes, I think, that become a big part of it. But those restorative practices are also, a good way to replenish and then
Yeah.
some.
Yeah, and you've hit the nail on the head because it really is so personal and individual. And if you have someone who's in that frenetic phase still of trying to fix and trying to sort and trying to organize and uh, just asking them to immediately become still and quiet might be too much of an adjustment. And when they know they've got 85 things on their to do list for today, being still and quiet and just noticing their breath might feel like a really frustrating and inefficient use of time. Doesn't mean it wouldn't be nice to get them there at some point, but it might not be the right place to start versus the person who is completely empty. They're a sponge that's been squeezed dry. They got nothing. And just setting them up
Yeah.
somewhere really soothing and cozy might be exactly what they need to help them feel a little bit more themselves.
Yeah, and I think it's why us, as yoga teachers, a big part of our job is listening, especially one-on-one, more therapeutic teachers.
Mm.
It's a lot of what you and I do is active listening, being able to also then, ask questions and really see what is most helpful for this person. And, when we look back and we go back to burnout and talk about causative factors too, there's a lot of things beyond even the scope probably of this podcast that can contribute to contribute to burnout. And a lot of it can relate back to their job. A lot of times one of the big ones is an imbalance between demands and resources. And that can apply to yoga teachers as well, because we often lack a lot of resources and have a lot of demands on us because there's, we have a busy schedules packed full and trying to squeeze it all in. And so regardless of the job, that imbalance between demands and resources, again, over a long period of time, and it really does depend on the person, how long our bodies can tolerate that. And everyone's a little bit different. There's not a clear timeline on that, but having unclear expectations or inadequate supervision, I think this ambiguity can kind of lead to that overwhelm and associated with burnout as well as kind of the opposite of being micromanaged and lacking the freedom to really control and create. And I think all of these are interesting places where yoga, I mean, obviously yoga can't completely compensate for working conditions. There's something that needs to be addressed in the workplace. And luckily there's a lot more visibility being brought to this issue. And it is a really big issue. But being able to look at how I can also now self-soothe and create an atmosphere within myself that I am able to control to some extent, and manipulate to some extent. That again, in a yoga class, I might have more clear expectations and supervision that I can then see through to fruition, and also noticing these inner resources that I have as well. There's the resources of my job, but there's also my inner resources and how I kind of manage that. And I think just this awareness of my energy as a resource and a currency, maybe perhaps, can be really interesting to just consider both in a yoga practice as well
Mm.
as in our lives. How am I spending that energy currency? Am I like so caught up in like doing the pose right and like nailing my crow or my handstand, and so, like maybe looking at the mindset behind it and the energy conservation that maybe I needed to conserve that day, maybe, or maybe I did need to expend and get it out and jump around and like
Mhm.
shake things off. I think there's a place for all of that, but I think there's a lot of ways that yoga can even not directly support those causative factors in the workplace, but they can support them at least in a way that creates a locus of control for us to feel like we can intervene and have some, influence over this internal body of resources as well.
You said a bunch of things that I love there. And firstly, when you were describing burnout as being the causative factors relating to a mismatch between resources and outputs, it being long term, maybe a lack of clear expectation, I was immediately thinking it sounds like you're describing parenting. So, for all the parents out there who are struggling and burnt out and
Right?
don't know what you're supposed to be doing and how you do it right and how you're meant to keep doing it every day for, 20 odd years. I hear you. I feel you. Um, the second thing was that, we can't just paper over any inequities in our life by our yoga practice. It's not, life sucks, work sucks, it's hard being a parent, but that's okay because we've got our practice. But on the other hand, there are definitely ways we can approach our practice that fill us up versus emptying us out. And I love the fact that you also made that unique and individual because I do think there's still a little bit of judgment in the yoga world about how we should practice and what constitutes a good practice and what's the correct way to respond to how we're feeling. And I really think we need to put the locus of control back to the individual, that reflective process that I always encourage at the beginning of practice, and I know you do too, of how do I really feel today and what do I really need today. And it could be that the appropriate response is to do some handstand hops, to jump forward and back, to,
Mhm.
to play with some arm balances, to give that energy and irritation an outlet, to kind of shift some stress or shake things up or change my vibration. Or it could be that I feel like I'm on fumes at the bottom of the tank and I really need to move slowly and thoughtfully and notice what things in my practice soothe me and fill me up and notice what things in my practice detract from my energy. And I think a lot of people just have the question in their mind when they're practicing of, am I doing it right? Versus, how does this
Mm.
feel for me? Is this helpful
And
for me? Is this depleting for me?
well, and I think what you were alluding to there too, just to make it really clear, is that I could also have two different students in the same practice who need different things and maybe just approach it in a different mindset. Take the exact same practice and approach it from an energy conservation versus an shake things off perspective. Even just that different approach, and that's kind of one of the items I want to drive home in this podcast is to give you as the consumer of yoga that power to even in a given class to find what you need. And I think one of the other things, along those, the causative factors too, is I think yoga also creates the clarity to see when do I just need to change my response to stress and help regulate the nervous system, or do I need to leave my job? Because that's a valid option, but it doesn't mean that everyone needs to leave their job to overcome burnout, because what ends up happening, especially with perfectionism, is you take that with you, right? The unrealistic expectations aren't from your job, it's actually from you. And I could speak from that personally, right? Like we all put our own pressures on ourselves as well. So I think yoga gives us that self-reflection, hopefully, to be able to see some of those patterns. And what a big thing that comes up, I think, that was really interesting to me in the research was this idea of emotional labor, which is a psychology term psychological process that basically, um, it's a process that's necessary to regulate our own emotions. So like we have to not only regulate our emotions on the daily already, but in certain jobs and most jobs, I think there's some of this. We have to also change our emotional response that might be natural. Like if you're customer facing, you might feel a certain way about the customer, but you have to be nice, right? And so the more of that, what's called emotional labor there is, the bigger the contrast between how you feel and what you have to do, the more emotional labor there is. And that could be, you know, hiding negative or displaying false positives. And obviously, that's not to say that we, have to act out all the time, but that, I think there is, for me in our yoga practice, a sense of processing and meditation of like, kind of for me, especially in meditation, of like allowing my brain. It's not like I'm thinking things through, but to me, it's kind of like clearing the cache. and and that kind of sense of emotional labor. Luckily, our job isn't high in it. I love that. But I think, all jobs have some of that. And so being able to show up as you are, like really, it's so hard for us, like you were saying, to just be like, this is me. I don't have to be handstand Tiffany today. I don't have to be like bendy Tiffany or strong Tiffany today. Like, I'm me. I get to be me today.
I love
And
that.
that's important.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of things in there that I want to draw out. The first one was that, in the moment approach to your practice of it could be exactly the same class. The teacher could be teaching exactly the same sequence, but we as individual students can tailor that experience to a much higher degree than I think people realize, purely through our internal approach of, you know, am I going faster than I want to go? Am I going slower than I want to go? Am I doing every single pose that's on the list, or am I stopping where it feels appropriate for me? Am I recruiting support? Am I doing it all, but with a mindset that's a bit more laid back and gentle and kind of holding my practice with a looser grip? There are so many ways to tailor the experience in the moment to give us, each of us, what we need, which is almost inevitably going to be different from the person next to us or the teacher. So there's that. And then there's also the longer term gift of yoga to help us be more self-aware and more discerning and more understanding of what's going on around us and what's going on within us, to recognize those patterns that you spoke about of, is this the job, or is this what I'm bringing to the job? And are there ways that I could do the same thing at work, show up to an experience that is to some extent dictated for me? This is the work I do. These are the people I interact with. There's things about that that I can change, but there are many things about that that I can't change. But just little shifts in my internal approach to that might change my experience. Knowing that there is this really high emotional burden from my job might be enough that I take a moment to compose myself before I walk out to a customer facing job and, put on that internal buffer of, I'm going in to create that emotional barrier. It's for the next 8 hours. And afterwards, I have a moment at the other side. I might close my eyes or take a couple of breaths or exhale out to kind of feel my way back into my own skin. Nothing's changed except my expectation of myself, my appreciation that
Mm,
this is a load, and I've got to recognize that that load will cost me some energy. That's the nature of the job. It's not inherently a bad thing, but recognizing it can change my response to it.
right. And I think, it's so multifaceted and individual, as you can see. There's so many different things. And I think behind burnout, and some really resonate with some people and
Mm,
others maybe less so, or maybe a lot of things resonate. I think when you find something, like whether that's the perfectionism or, we've talked about a million different kind of things
mm,
behind this, you kind of got to dig into that a little bit more. But really what I'm trying to do, I have to shift the patterns behind it. It's not just like there's not a magical pose. Even like
mm,
if we had to pick something, like you talked, like we'd probably point right to restorative and yin, which again isn't a magical solution, though it's usually often very much needed. It really, in my opinion, is about changing the patterns. And what we have to do is obviously, I think, shift how we see stress because what happens is, and I think this is getting more attention in the media, but we all tend to see stress as a negative thing. But really, the right dose of a healthy stress and the right amount of recovery equals positive adaptations. I mean, we go back to sports and professional athletes and resilience training, really the opposite side of burnout. And it's the same exact thing. I'm trying to apply a stimulus or maybe weightlifting, a load to the tissues to instigate an adaptation. And that is positive, right? I can't, I can't expand my strength capacity without actually loading the tissues. So I have to do something to instigate those positive adaptations. And so, with burnout, it's the same. It's just, if I go do really intensive things with someone who's really burnt out, they will be more tired. Most people are going to be more exhausted. And so, the positive, the amount, I guess, the dose is what's really different, but we still have to apply those healthy stressors again and an optimal recovery period or whatever kind of tools. We won't go into specifics there to instigate those positive adaptations. So, obviously, a big part of this is training the nervous system to be adaptable and responsive to those inputs. And I think so much in a yoga practice, the non judgmental inquiry, our curiosity and introspection, this energy as a currency thing are all really important to be able to navigate that so that we know, like, when I'm working through this burnout spectrum, it might just be, I'm just going to use a really easy, an easy one, like 10 minutes of high intensity training, to instigate that. And we can do variations, iterations of that, and maybe in a yoga practice. But some kind of like short, higher intensity stimulus to stimulate that more sympathetic response and to rev the nervous system with maybe a lot of restorative and recovery support after. And over time, that might, become longer and longer, just like a professional athlete, which I've worked with a lot of over the years. And I know I couldn't do the training routines that they were doing, like they've gotten there over time. They didn't just start training all freaking day, all day long, day one. You get there because you're training the tissues. And I think, it's off topic, but I think a lot of where the sports injuries happen are where we haven't given the tissues enough time to respond and adapt. And, um, you know, that's a longer story. But I think, what I love about this, about talking about burnout and resilience and the resilience retreat that we run is really looking at, these kind of three main components that I think are really important. One is the nervous system resilience, which we're kind of alluding to now, is, training the nervous system both to turn on and turn off. So not just the recovery or the restorative and yin and meditation and things, but also the more upregulating practices as a way to also train the downregulation sometimes better. So the nervous system training, then the tissue training and the connective tissue resilience, which are so important with things like eccentric training, myofascial release as a way to optimize tissue health and other things. And then the third is like the mental outlook, which again was kind of one of the main reasons I wanted to do this podcast, because I think in the resilience retreat, we talk about all this and we dig a lot deeper into all of these topics and really the experience of being able to feel it in your body. But, I think there's so much more to the mental outlook that, you can only put so much into 2 full days. It's a 2 full day retreat. But I think things like, even there are, in the research, there is an association between things like just being open-minded and better outcomes in burnout, optimism, confidence, accepting support, changing how we see ourselves in the world, our sense of efficacy and purpose. All of these, I think, are such great things that we can look at in a yoga practice. And even just from listening to this podcast, I mean, those are things, each one of those words, each one of those things I just mentioned are things I think you could journal and meditate on and, like chew on in your yoga practice and see what that means to you and how you relate to it. If you are in the burnout spectrum, like, am I accepting support? Am I open-minded? Am I finding ways to build confidence and optimism? How do I see myself in the world? Do I feel effective? Do I have a purpose? What is my role in this world? I think It's a lot.
But even
But
just
I
starting
think
with
those
something
things
so
are important.
simple as recognizing where there are high demand tasks or functions or days, and giving yourself space for those, space to gear up and space to wind down. Even that for me makes a fundamental difference of recognizing, this is a challenging thing for me. This requires some emotional energy from me. So I'm going to prepare, and I'm going to give myself space to decompress afterwards. Even that little thing is like the difference between somebody forcing you to run a marathon by, running behind you with a cattle prod versus you choosing to run a marathon. Both of those things are really difficult, but the internal experience is very different when you approach it through your own volition. You've prepared and you're ready to rest and stretch and refuel afterwards versus it happening to you. The internal experience,
Mm.
night and day different.
Yeah, and I think it also changes how we approach our practice, like from this perfectionist kind of goal-oriented approach to being present and being open to whatever. I mean, we've talked about this already, whatever our experience is in that day. Embracing the humanness of, our ebb and flow of energy levels. And the imposter syndrome is like, I remember hearing someone once say, like, having that imposter syndrome actually shows it's a good thing because it shows that you care about what you're doing. I think making friends with these things, befriending them, and getting curious to them. What does that mean? Is it holding me back? Is it something that's allowing me to be curious? Is it something that maybe reminds me to keep learning? And I think, one of the solutions, to I said there were a few different types of burnout, but one of them, especially the understimulated one, but also the one that feels inefficient and ineffective, and the imposter syndrome. Sometimes an important antidote can be learning, and that can be in a very like regimented way in an academic setting, or like an online training, or it could be podcast or books, or learning can be a lot of different things. But for me, that's a big thing. We talked about that in our sustainability episode of like, for me, once I start feeling that way, once I start feeling things going in that direction, I've got to invest. And for me, the learning is a big part of it. But, creating your ritual on your mat, having a kind of a sanctuary on your mat where you can release that performative, goal oriented, to be able to be present and open, and expand your awareness and your attention to noticing how both regulating the nervous system can be helpful in certain amounts over time, and how also training your body to relax and down regulate can be very, very effective in refilling the well over time. And also knowing that if you've had burnout for a long period of time, it's not going to self correct overnight. I do need to be patient with myself. And I love MFR. We include MFR in the training, in the retreat, because it's such an effective self-soothing modality and self-care tool. And so we do one on kind of the importance of upregulating the nervous system and downregulating the nervous system, training the connective tissues, and strength training and yoga, which maybe that's another episode as well. But MFR, and also all these little questions and ways that we can kind of personalize it, because it really is so individual. And hopefully this is giving you some ideas of um, things you might focus on. Like, I recommend, if you're on the burnout spectrum, picking anyone, like maybe you were listening to this and writing down a whole bunch of different things that stood out, like picking any one of those things and journaling about it, thinking about it in your practice, any of those limiting factors. There's not like an easy answer to perfectionism or imposter syndrome, but I think where the the work really comes in is in the non-judgmental curiosity, and looking at in different ways. I think our yoga mat gives us a route in to look at it in a way where where we're used to looking inward, right? And then hopefully we take that with us out into our work and our life, to reflect and see, what can I change, what needs to change, what resources do I have inside of me. And hopefully, gives you a lot of different things to chew on, to see what might be a helpful one for you. Because I don't think there's an easy solution as far as practices. I think really the key to burnout is in changing our mindset.
And I love that that's where you kind of wrapped up because, as usual, if you've come to the Yoga Medicine podcast looking for the 3 poses you can do to beat burnout, you maybe haven't listened to the previous 100 or so episodes because that's just not how things work. Not just here, but I think in reality, in the universe, is there's no one pose or practice or 3 poses or practices that will beat burnout. It really requires us to get to know ourselves a little bit better, to understand the demands being placed on us, and also to understand what we can do to help meet those demands, whether that is recruiting more support, asking for help, setting boundaries, asking for clearer expectations, seeking external avenues for education or inspiration, or even just knowing on our mat what feels good to me, what feels nurturing to me, and what feels depleting to me. Even that simple level of inquiry can be so powerful when you're on the burnout spectrum. So I love that that's where you wrap things up.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, there's so much to this. It's hard to just do like a quick episode on, but I think that should give people a lot of things to chew on and to know that there's not like you said, one simple thing, but to really reflect and know that the big change, and I speak from personal experience, both with myself and a lot of patients that I've worked with and students that I've worked with. Um, in my experience, the big changes happen with those small mindset shifts that you can change, and working on your mat is a great place to start. So hopefully that's placed some little questions in your brain. Maybe you've written down along the way that you can journal or chew on in your own way at some point, and know that that is really where the potent work happens. So let us know how it goes. I hope this is helpful. We do have our resilience retreat, that's what I've been talking about. It's called the resilience retreat, and really looking at how burnout and resilience are like two sides of the spectrum, and resilience training, whether you're talking about pro athletes or stress resilience, is very similar to what we talk about with burnout. It's just slightly different doses, but a very similar approach to being able to train how the nervous system responds, and to create a resilient body and mind. So if you're interested, yogamedicine.com has all our resources. You might find an in-person one near you. We also have tons of burnout resources on Yoga Medicine Online. I have a burnout playlist. If you go on my personal page there, you could check out, and always more resources coming here. So we appreciate your feedback and insights. And thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you like the show, please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com, or check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine. You can also email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being a part of our Yoga Medicine community. We look forward to seeing you again. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.